Empires are usually remembered for violence. Armies marching across borders, cities burning, flags raised after conquest. That image is familiar and misleading. War is unstable, expensive, temporary. Empires that lasted centuries did not survive by fighting endlessly. They learned that force alone could not secure control for generations. Armies could conquer territory, but they could not hold it forever. So empires developed something more effective than violence. They made power look legitimate. This is the history rarely explained. Not how empires conquered, but how they kept everything they took. And they did it without breaking the law. The first and most important decision, the first act of empire, was not invasion. It was definition. Before soldiers arrived, administrators did. Before violence, there were maps. Before resistance, there were documents. Land was not seized. It was reclassified. Across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Australia, imperial officials examined territories already inhabited for centuries and declared them something new, unused, unproductive, empty. Not because no one lived there, but because the people living there did not meet imperial definitions of ownership. They did not fence land. They did not title it. They did not register it. If land did not exist on paper, it legally did not exist at all. And what does not exist cannot be stolen. It can only be claimed. When law replaced morality, empires rarely described their actions as conquest. They described them as administration. Bureaucracy replaced brutality. Surveyors measured land using foreign systems. Maps were redrawn. Borders were fixed where none had existed before. Entire landscapes were converted into numbers, parcels, and property. Ownership became something that required documentation. Those without documents had no legal presence. No legal presence meant no protection. Removal could now occur quietly, procedurally, without a single law being violated. The law was not broken. It was followed. People were not killed. They were redefined. The removal of people did not begin with violence. It began with records. Census forms changed. Names disappeared. Categories replaced identities. Communities were no longer recorded as societies. They were recorded as labor pools. Able-bodied or surplus, productive or expendable. Once reduced to categories, policy could determine value. And policy never measured humanity, only output. People who produced were tolerated. Those who did not were relocated, punished, or erased from official records. Administration as control empires did not rely on constant force. They relied on routine. Taxes enforced obedience. Permits controlled movement. Past systems determined where people could live, work, or travel. Breaking these rules was not rebellion. It was crime. And criminals do not receive sympathy. Compliance became survival. People followed the system not because they agreed with it, but because resisting it meant exclusion, and exclusion meant starvation, imprisonment, or removal. Legal suffering violence did not disappear. It became regulated. Punishment followed failure, not resistance. Missed quotas triggered consequences. Inability to pay taxes resulted in eviction. Refusal to work became a criminal offense. The law functioned exactly as written. That mattered, because when suffering follows rules, it appears justified. People rarely rebel against systems they believe are legitimate. They endure them. Food was never just food. Famines are often described as unavoidable disasters. Bad harvests, unlucky weather. That explanation removes responsibility. In reality, food rarely vanished during imperial famines. It was grown, collected, stored, exported. Markets remained protected. Contracts were honored. Trade continued uninterrupted. The law did not require feeding the population. It required protecting property and commerce. When people starved while food left their shores, the system was still considered successful. Death was not the failure of policy. It was the outcome of it. Why nothing was ever called a crime. Empires understood one essential truth. Crimes require victims recognized by law. So recognition was removed. Villages erased from maps had no legal status. Communities removed from records had no claims. Deaths without documentation were invisible. Nothing illegal occurred. Everything followed procedure. The system was clean, on paper. Why resistance collapsed? Resistance is easy to imagine when oppression is obvious. When violence is visible, when power is brutal, when injustice is undeniable. It is far harder when oppression feels lawful. Empires understood this distinction perfectly. They did not rely on constant force to maintain control. They relied on legitimacy. When authority appeared legal, resistance could be reframed as criminality rather than defiance. Debt created dependency. Taxes enforced compliance. Laws framed punishment as order. Survival itself became conditional on obedience. Breaking the system was no longer an act of rebellion. It was a violation of rules. And rule breakers did not receive sympathy. Exclusion followed. Loss of land, loss of food, loss of protection. People did not submit because they lacked courage. They submitted because the system was designed so that survival required participation. Resistance collapsed not through fear alone, but through structure. The myth of progress. Empires rarely believed they were cruel. They believed they were modern. Civilization, they argued, required order. Order required regulation. Regulation required enforcement. And enforcement demanded efficiency. Human cost became secondary. If cultures collapsed, it was unfortunate. If communities vanished, it was inevitable. If people suffered, it was the price of advancement. Progress justified everything. Language softened reality. Displacement became development. Erasure became reform. By framing destruction as necessity, empires removed moral responsibility from their actions. What mattered was not who was lost, but what was gained. How history was cleaned after the damage was done, the record remained. Reports spoke of growth. Statistics showed productivity. Infrastructure replaced communities. The paperwork told a success story. History books described modernization, expansion, and governance. They recorded laws passed, railways built, markets opened. Rarely did they record removal. Rarely did they record erasure. What appeared legal in its time was later described as necessary. And necessary actions are rarely questioned. The suffering was absorbed into footnotes or omitted entirely. The system did not Yindi empires eventually fell. Flags changed. Borders shifted. Administrations renamed themselves. But the system remained. Legal ownership over lived land. Policy over people. Paperwork over reality. The machinery of empire did not vanish with decolonization. It was inherited. Modern states continued to govern through the same frameworks. Legality first, humanity second. The final illusion, the greatest illusion empire ever created was this: that nothing had been taken. After all, laws were followed. Contracts were signed. Records were kept. Everything appeared legitimate. But legality is not justice. And history often confuses the two. The truth: empires did not steal everything in secret. They did it openly, with documents, with stamps, with signatures. They did not need to break the law. They wrote it. And once everything was legal, nothing was stolen, officially. That is how empires took everything without ever breaking the law. If this changed how you understand history, this channel exists to examine what power hides behind legality, paperwork, and silence. More stories like this are coming. Stories history rarely explains this way. Subscribe to The Forgotten Empire if you want to understand how the past really worked.